On this year-end special report of FieldLink, we recap highlights of the 2024 commodity markets with market analyst Jody Lawrence from Nashville. Jody will pass on a few tips for growers as we flip the calendar to 2025. Stay tuned for this episode of FieldLink. And welcome back to FieldLink as we recap 2024. Joining us from Nashville is Jody Lawrence. Jody, welcome to this final 2024 episode. This highlights 2024 and some of the major happenings that took place in the commodity markets throughout this past year.
Well, it was certainly a big year, Bill, and Merry Christmas to everybody here as we sit a week from on the 17th, a week from Christmas Eve. Yeah, a big year. And really what the theme of the year was that I've been talking about in all of our post-harvest meetings is the entire agriculture industry right now, we should be taking a victory lap because of you look what has happened this year with all the record yields that have come out. That and we have the January update coming out that the U.S. corn yield is going to easily exceed 180, maybe fall somewhere between 182 and 185. While the bean yield wasn't record, it was certainly impressive. The cycle that world agriculture really has fallen into this year, and from the tail end, the last 6 months of 23 as well. So for the last 18 months, is that as the industry has advanced, as everyone in the industry has done their job, from the all the seed guys, all the chemists in the new products, all the genetics, all of the new compounds, certainly the biggest part of this is every farmer and grower out there who's been willing to try new things, to use the new technology. You think about just auto steer was a big deal, and now GPS takes over it. You have more efficiency on the farm. And when you look at the products and that you have, what we would call this, I guess, pretty much across the entire U.S. is, probably a B plus weather year. It wasn't Goldilocks, but we still were able to jump up the national corn yield from last year's national corn yield of, call it 177 to 183. And that 6 bushel per acre bump is the largest record year to record year jump in the history of U.S. yields. And, you're pushing a 4% yield bump. Certainly we've, seen big jumps before after a drought year, like, 2012 to 2013, or just kind of an iffy weather year. But this year really should be a gold star for everyone in the industry. But the hard part about the nature of agriculture is it's very cannibalistic, that every time we do something great, the supply goes up. And if demand does not go up accordingly, then all of a sudden prices go down. And this year, they certainly have taken an ugly turn as we head into the end of the year from where we sat just at the beginning of the year. And to highlight that, this is one of the 2 years in the last 25 years that the price of beans and corn did not exceed the January highs anywhere over the course of the year. So that just shows you the competition that we now have from South America, because we're in a 12-month out of the year cycle, and the ability for every major region, whether it's Russia, largest wheat producer, Brazil, largest bean producer, or the U.S. largest corn producer, when everything goes our way, we can outproduce the escalation of demand now. Big part of that certainly is China's faltering economy, but it's an impressive place to be in the industry when you say that you can that you can produce a surplus to feeding the world.
Right. Yeah. And great point. Weather cooperated for the most part across the U.S. this year. Yields, tip your Stetson to the growers and the researchers, as you mentioned. We've done a great job. We've produced, as you mentioned.
you and I have, very close relationships with everybody at Helena Products Group, and we go through that lab. And every summer, we do the field day down there, and they talk about new products and give us tours. And we're amazed by how smart they are. And then when they tell us the challenges that they have, that y'all are bringing products to, the 25 market that have been in development for a decade and approval
Right.
for 3 to 5 years. So the lag in the industry is frustrating. But you look ahead, okay, how long until we have a 200 bushel national corn yield? Is that another decade away? Because if you start to look back, these big yield jumps are coming about every 5 years, especially in corn. Beans hasn't quite yet, but you've got so much brain power and work ethic and everything in our industry that all we're doing is our job. And unfortunately, we're the only ones that get hurt when everybody does their job well.
Yeah, I just sit back and I see some of these yields. The NCGA National Corn Growers Yield Contest just recently came out, and we've got growers winning contests with over 400 plus bushels per acre. And I just sit back and reflect in my time in agriculture. I can recall in the early stages of my career, I had a grower that I worked with was the National Corn Growers winner. He tapped out over 300 bushel. As a matter of fact, it was 333. And we thought that was absolutely unheard of. And we're talking 25 years ago. And today they're at 425 in some acres. It's just unbelievable the production that we can do today. And Jody, you touched on it. 25 years ago, we didn't have near the competition that we have today. South America has really escalated their technology and done a really good job in becoming a global competitor with us. And that's something that we in agriculture, as American agriculture, we got to pay attention to.
Well, it's one of the main slides of the presentations that I'll be making all winter. I'm just going to read some of the bullet points from it. And this is just from Brazil. This has nothing to do with anybody else in the world. Brazil's average acreage expansion runs right about 3% annually. It's down a little bit this year because of the price, but 3% you can figure. And they're going to plant right at 115 million acres of beans this year. The U.S. planted 87 for comparison. So they're already planting 30 million more acres than we do. And now this is, you talk about the comparison stuff, what's happened in the last 20 years. The 2004, 2005 planted acreage in Brazil for beans was 65 million. So there's 50 million acres that they've added over the last 20 years. And their bushel per yield average this year was 52.1, almost exactly what the U.S. came in at. Whereas in 0405, their yield was 35 bushels an acre. And for comparison, the U.S. bean yield in 2005 was 42 bushels an acre. So we're up. They're up 50%, and we're up roughly, what would that be? 20%,
right?
In yield bump. And our corn yield. And I found this interesting because we were just talking about corn, but the corn yield in 2005, the trend line average for the U.S. was 148, and we think that the USDA is going to use 182, maybe 182 and a half for 2025. So you can just see that this, really hits the nail on the head of how, what a great job everybody in the industry is doing. And back to Brazil, you have to look at Brazil in a couple different ways. Certainly the competition and, worldwide, the genetics are improving yield. But if we just go to Brazil, you talked about their new higher level of competition. 20 years ago, when China really started pouring the money into to Brazil to make sure that they had a source of food, and beans in particular, that wasn't going to try to come in and influence their political actions, basically they have gone from what we would have considered 20 years ago. They were using late 70s, early 80s equipment, seed inputs, because they were a small player in the global ag business, or they were a growing player. And right about 2000, the US was using just over 22% of all the world's fertilizer inputs, whatever that spectrum is. You can have weed control, just everything on there.
Sure.
Basically, we're using almost 25% of the world's available supply to grow our crops. And in the last 20, 25 years, the US is down to just a 10% share of the world market of using agricultural inputs. So that really highlights, certainly there's some positive things. There's an efficiency quota in here that's a little harder to put your thumb on, but it does show that there is growing competition around the world, Brazil being the biggest one. And that, you can see it reflective, because if you and I were running a business and we said, okay, we need to make more sales, who is our biggest prospect? Right now, and for the last 20 years, it's been Brazil. We would have gone to Brazil and sold them the latest, greatest, and everything. Yep. And that's what John Deere did. It's what Syngenta did. It's what all the seed companies did. So it's not, you certainly don't blame them, because they've got a company to grow and they are publicly traded, so they have to make profits. But then you get to the ultimate point of this. Obviously, there is pushback and there is frustration this year, because where we're starting with prices, only the very deepest pockets in U.S. agriculture can make money or at break even if they're counting all of their expenses, including land and the opportunity cost of renting it rather than farming it. And the problem that you run into, if you and I if we're John Deere and 9 of our customers say, yeah, we'll pay you whatever the sticker price is, but one of our customers comes to us and goes, I can't make my numbers work, I need you to give me a discount. We are not going to alienate 90% of our customer base for a 10% customer because their numbers are off this year. And I think that's the hardest point, and really the hardest thing to swallow in U.S. agriculture, that while we're still, incredibly important, and that's not to diminish that fact, it's just we have a lot more competition than we have over the last couple decades.
Yeah, definitely something for us to focus on. And one of those areas for us to focus on is moving away from just being such a wonderful production giant to becoming a group of growers that can provide value in a much different way. And one of those areas is utilizing, crops like corn and soybeans and others for alternative energy and alternative crops. And we're taking a look at continuing to grow that space. But, it has its challenges too, right, Jody?
Well, you really have, if I'm seeing a light at the end of the tunnel that isn't another oncoming freight train, it is certainly the sustainable aviation fuel market, the ethanol market, and things like that. Now, the headwinds that we see are obviously Zellman, Trump's EPA nominee for that job, has been through his entire legislative career. He's out of New York, out on Long Island. He has been anti-biofuel. So that makes me concerned for a couple different reasons. But there are also big export potential for anything, for whether it's ethanol or whether it's biodiesel. So there's, whether it's domestically used or whether it's exported around the world, we'll have to navigate through that after inauguration, and we see kind of how policy falls. So that's a big one. And the thing I think that frustrated everybody this year, and I got a really good piece of information from one of my sources yesterday, that the used cooking oil imports from China that have been so hotly contested during the sustainable aviation fuel growth and the blending and everything in California for the $1 a gallon tax credit, was the amount of palm oil that was labeled whether illegally or gamesmanship, however
Okay.
you want to call it, that was imported into the U.S. basically meant the U.S. did not use 270 million more bushels of beans for that program.
Mm,
Because I know a year ago when we were having this discussion, this was what I was really excited about, just the expansion, the plant expansion,
right.
everybody that was behind SAF, and for the EPA, the Treasury, every investor, every lobbyist group that got the industry to this point to have missed that loophole and not been able to tie it up by now is just mind-boggling to me, because you're talking about billions and billions of dollars that the industry left on the table because of what amounts to an oversight, or at least they didn't, lobby the right person with enough really good scotch to get to get it closed. And
Wow.
to give you an idea, across the board, let's take it at face value, 270 million bushels. We've got beans struggling to stay over $10, both old and new crop right now. Current U.S. ending stocks are 470 million bushels. If you took that 270 off of it, we would be 50 million bushels lower than last year, when bean prices were comfortably in the 1250 to 1350 range. So you're talking a 2 to 250 minimum difference in them failing, to get that policy corrected. And you just look at it across the board, that would push corn prices up 50, 60, 70 cents potentially back up to kind of that magic $5 area. So if you want to talk about one thing that really is disappointing and could be easily changed, and maybe the Trump tariffs and the trade war stops everything coming in from China, in 5 weeks, when inauguration happens. We'll see. But
Right.
that to me is the biggest thing, because you're talking about an enormous amount of additional use that we're allowing China to benefit from.
Wow. And meanwhile, great intentions. That one loophole, huge miss for the American producer. Jody, let's talk about some of the politics. Politics has been obviously in the headlines in 24. Huge transition here in the United States, but also, around the world, a lot of shaking up going on. As you take a look at 24 and look into 25, where do you see this ship going? How do you see leadership shifting policy for agriculture?
Well, we'll start with the fact that it's no mystery, and I'm certainly not making some wild political statement here, that our constituents in the rural areas and in the ag industry are largely red states, and we know how they voted. And I would imagine 90+% of everyone listening to this podcast was happy with the election. Now, we hope it's not one of these let's be careful what we wish for moments, because I think that Trump's intention, if you go back and kind of look how the trade war and the tariffs in 2018 worked their way out, that I hope that his trade team, because he is bringing back a lot of the key players that negotiated phase 1 and phase 2 with China, that the tariffs are the threat and the hammer of opening up and reopening a lot of trade with China coming back. But honestly, China's economy is so bad right now, you can't force feed somebody stuff they don't need.
Right.
And our monster that of Brazil that the U.S. helped create, because I've talked to several farmers that were on, whatever you want to call it, goodwill trips down there to show them practices, to show them things, to talk to groups of Brazilian farmers about how to raise more bushels. This is the problem, because all of a sudden, even if China became our best friend and we had never had another political issue with them or them with us, we still can't just tell Brazil, hey, just shut down. All this expansion, all this money, you just need to stop, or cut back 10 million acres. So the political policy is really going to be key. And like I said, I already made the reference to Zellman. You
Yep.
look at several different people that have been nominated to this point, whether they're going to be hard line with China, or this is simply moving towards improved trade relationships, because I don't think politically or human rights will ever get to that correct spot. That to me is going to be the big thing. And I wish I had a prediction, because I just don't know. As we know from 16 to 20, Trump, as soon as you think you've got a beat on him, he does a pivot and things don't turn out as well as hoped. But politically, and you look at a couple things that we generally don't look at, but are certainly important. Argentina's new president, Milei, who was the past president, served some time in jail for corruption, then came back and got elected, has put in some very, very strict policy, cost-cutting policy, of efficiency, much like what Musk apparently is going to try to do with the Department of Government Efficiency in Trump's cabinet, that Argentina's inflation rate is dropping dramatically. And what that does, it helps, it creates a little bit more competition. And Brazil is improving, but their inflation's out of control, and their farmers wait for, an adjustment in the black market peso before they really understand the value of their beans. So if we were talking about it, certainly, and notice we hadn't even gotten to Russia and Ukraine yet.
Right.
So to me, the biggest thing is China. The next thing is, let's see what happens in South American politics, because Putin's not going anywhere. And, if that ends, I don't think it really has much impact, because the biggest non-event story over the last 2.5 years has been Russia invading Ukraine, and what we thought was going to end world production of wheat and stop, exports of it from that area. It became a complete fallacy. So China, let's get things straightened out with China and get SAF back on track, so more domestic use, and then I think we've at least got more stable ground than we're standing on right now.
One of the things as we take a look at 24 is this continued area of interest rates. Jody, certainly going to impact producers. What's your insight there as we get ready to flip this calendar to 25?
I think you just have to understand that, and I'm not going to call them bad habits, because procrastination, or patience, as some people like to call it, was a great strategy from September of 20, COVID, all the way through June of last year, because it always seemed, okay, I'm going to sell some, but then a little bit better opportunity came along, for the better part of, for almost 3 full years. And then, as the things we talked about earlier, overproduction, good weather, improved industry standards, that all of a sudden there are no rallies to be had, because I think I saw something in it and I couldn't confirm it, but it sounds reasonable enough where prices are, that the world has the largest corn, bean, and wheat ending stocks are evenly distributed around the world that we've probably ever seen. I'm sure you could go back and find a year or two that there was more excess. But right now, if everybody has plenty of everything they need, there's no real motivation for anybody to say, hey, I need to start buying this because it's cheap. And now it's going the other way, where farmers were patient from, after COVID in selling. Now all the end users are being very patient in buying, because all they see is, okay, I'll buy a little corn at $5.25. All right, I'll buy a little more at $4.75, and now I'll start buying it at $4.30 to $4.50. Right. And they've been right for the last 18 months. So that's my concern and frustration, and it's all built on the base of all the things we've talked about to this point. It's going to be a tough year, and you're just going to have to realize that there are years running every business where you just don't make a profit, or you do everything you can, and whether that's through increased production, that you have to get this to as manageable a break even or small loss as possible. Because right now, I could easily see by the time we start planting beans that beans are at $9, and I know nobody can make it there. And if beans go to $9, that's $4.25 at best corn. So the immediate outlook is not good because of the oversupply of everything. But the wild card of tell me what Trump's policy is going to be like in 6 weeks. And Mother Nature always has the final say. And there are black swans every year that you and I could sit here, and we just went through the longest list I think we've ever talked about. And one of those things will be bullish. It's just impossible right now to predict what that may be.
Well, the strategy right now is to really understand your expenses, know your math, I guess is the take-home point. And Jody, any sales targets that growers ought to take a good look at for 25?
Corn is holding up really well right now. The yield being trimmed a little bit, and then domestic use for ethanol is up a little bit. Exports were better. Hard to tell whether that was front-loaded ahead of the election. Mexico still is our number one buyer. If you see, and this is all going to be futures based, if you see any December corn rally over 440 against December futures, or look out into March 26, hard to believe we're already talking about 26 in this scenario, where there's carry in the market, and just be willing to do all the math that you have to do, because if you don't know your break even going into this year, it's going to make it even more problematic. And I can tell everybody right now, you're not going to like it, but if you don't know it, you're going to cause yourself more problems than whatever short-term heartburn you may have avoided.
You bet. So know your math is the take-home point as we flip the calendar for 25. And Jody Lawrence, I want to thank you for joining us from Nashville as we kind of hit the highlights for 24 and start to flip that calendar for 25.
Well, thank you, Bill. I appreciate being included in every episode. Appreciate all the listeners and all the hard work that you and Cooper and everybody that puts this together, other than, just you and me talking. We get all the credit, but everybody else does all the work. And want to wish everybody a Merry and safe Christmas, and moving on to a prosperous 2025.
Thanks for listening to this special report episode of FieldLink. Be sure to tell your friends about the FieldLink podcast, and be sure to follow us on your favorite platform wherever you get your podcasts so you'll never miss an episode.